Hey guys, it's Joel, and I have just taken 2 weeks off for Christmas, so I got a big stack of books, and I had some time to read them, finally. I don't really take a ton of time off work because I really, really like what I do. It's also just really hard to cancel people because you gotta call a lot of different people, and it takes a lot of time, and it's easier just to kind of work through the day. So unless I'm taking a substantial amount of time off, I don't ever really cancel. But I was had to quarantine to see so my daughter could see her grandparents. And one of the first books that I read was Neil Gaiman's Norse Mythology. Um, so Neil Gaiman, if you're not familiar with him, is mainly a novelist. He did some comic books. Sandman was one of the ones he was famous for. At the beginning of his career, he wrote American Gods. He deals mainly with things that have to do with fantasy, but not fantasy like Lord of the Rings as much as fantasy like deep mythology. And kind of the way that all of his work is always about the way that somebody makes sense out of the universe, and the kind of personal mythological lenses through which we see the world. And a lot of times what he'll do is take those lenses to their like ultimate conclusion to kind of show you the implications of what you believe. So I don't do a ton of fiction on here because most of what I share is about clinical therapy. However, I feel, as a more Jungian depth psychology leaning clinician, that mythology is very relevant to clinical work and the way that we see the world and the way that people kind of make meaning out of life. And so Norse mythology is not an academic book. It's not didactic. It is just narrative. So it kind of takes the set of a couple of different short stories set in the pantheon of Norse mythology, and it goes through all of the different stories. He's retelling stories accurately, like as they appear in the Prose Edda and like other Norse mythology sources, but he doesn't. He also is taking them and making them easier to read or understand, giving you some context that may not be in the primary sources. One of the things about Norse mythology that's kind of interesting to me is that there's a lot of blanks that you can kind of feel the texture of it, but you don't really understand why certain things are the case. Like, for example, in Greek mythology, you kind of understand like these are the big gods, these are the small gods under them. They kind of act like people. They want to have affairs with women, and they want to, kind of do all of the silly things that people do. There's a saying that Greeks made their men gods and their gods men, and that the gods are very kind of silly and petty, but then they describe Achilles or somebody, and he's described as this kind of godlike thing. So you kind of know the rules of Greek mythology. Norse mythology, you don't. There's some weird things in there, like something like Loki, for example. He's a god, but not really a god because he's a frost giant, which is an enemy of the gods, yet he's erased by them, so he's kind of allowed to be around. And he's the enemy of them, but they're not really getting rid of him, although it's kind of understood that he will play these tricks, but sometimes the tricks are that he kills them or their kids, and then they attack him, and then he runs away. Yet Loki's still in the pantheon of Norse gods, so like, what is he? Is he a god? Is he not? I mean, the other gods, if you look at Norse historical sites, like, I don't know, Balder and Thor and Odin, they have places named after them, towns and fjords and mountains, and Loki doesn't have anything named after him. So it's like, maybe in the common mind, he's not a good thing. He's just sort of a force of nature, maybe, that this thing is inevitability and entropy and chaos, and we can't quite get rid of it, but also we have to learn to live with it, but we don't like it. Maybe that's one way to interpret what Loki is. I don't know, because Norse mythology doesn't really give us those rules in the way that a lot of mythological systems do. And what Gaiman does really well in this book that's interesting is you kind of feel that, but he never goes in and tries to make things canon and say this is the way that it works in a way that wouldn't lend itself well to Norse mythology, just as an academic field. So I think it's a great book. I really enjoyed it. It's short. You can read it quickly. My first thought when I saw he was doing like just Norse mythology stories was that it was going to be more of a publisher book than an author book, where they're like, hey, you haven't really written a novel for a while. You're a mythological writer. Could you just write some old myths down and then we'll reprint them and put your name on it? And it isn't that. I mean, he spent a lot of time with it. A lot of these stories he started a long time ago. I would recommend it. So anyway, first book review, and I hope that's helpful. Have a good New Year's.